All right, welcome back, friends and comrades. I am here with C. Derick Varn and Gabriel Raeburn, who's a fellow at Harvard. Tonight's conversation is going to be with Gabriel Raeburn about his article about the dissolution of the first, probably most serious academic journal dedicated to the study of Marxism in U.S. history, and how it dissolved in a very short time frame and emerged in the mid 1970s and was over by the late 1970s. The name of the journal is called Marxist Perspectives. It was started, there's issue number 1, spring 1978. It was started by a firebrand Marxist historian of slavery in the U.S. South named Eugene Genovese, who you may or may not know about. Tonight, you're going to learn a lot about him. He was actually a colleague of Christopher Lasch, the U.S. historian and cultural critic, social critic, who my first book on the family was working with Lasch. Derick Varn is working on a book on Lasch. That's part of the reason why Varn is here. Lasch and Genovese were comrades. They were both Marxist historians. They were both central in the creation of Marxist Perspectives. But let us sort of step back, Gabriel, and have you just tell us a bit about your research. I understand that you study the history of Pentecostalism, which I find very interesting. And you also study slavery, the history of slavery as well. And you have an interest in United States radical thought, socialist thought.
Yeah, I'm a jack of all trades historian in that sense. Well, firstly, thank you for inviting me on. It's great to discuss this. I published this article quite a few years ago now, but I've started to think about Genovese again recently, so it's kind of perfect timing. Yeah, my actual historical training was in the history of religious conservatism in the US, but I increasingly became interested in the history of slavery. And so this project was kind of started as a side project, but also bridges those two worlds. Genovese is someone who started as a historian of slavery in a Marxist tradition, but then became a religious conservative. So it kind of, even if intellectual history wasn't my training, it bridges both of those worlds.
All right, so Genovese, let's begin here. I don't know, Varn, I feel like you might find this figure frustrating and interesting.
Oh, I knew him as a conservative.
You're from the South.
Yeah, I mean, I literally almost went to Emory. Like, I knew who he was, but I did not know of his Marxist pedigree till I studied Christopher Lasch seriously about 20 years after my first encounter with Genovese. But like, I knew Genovese as kind of an obnoxious conservative professor from Emory, to be quite blunt. And I found his trajectory really interesting, particularly his early work on slavery. But he was actually somewhat infamous when I was an undergrad for pulling stunts at Emory's campus and trying to like censor people and push Whittaker Chambers narratives and stuff like that. It was kind of how I knew him, and I knew Lasch actually in a similar dynamic because I knew Lasch mostly from conservatives who liked them in the aughts. But Genovese and Lasch are kind of interesting to me because I knew that when I actually figured this history out, that Genovese deviated far more severely from his Marxist origins than Lasch did. Like there was a clean break. Lasch, despite what he says in the 87 Tikkun article, doesn't completely break with Marxism pretty much ever. I mean, I was reading late interviews he did in Telios magazine where he's caveating his Marxism, and the caveats are getting rather extensive, but there's no like complete disavowal the way you have with Genovese. So yeah, I found your article very fascinating. It cleared up some things that were not clear to me from the Miller biography on Lasch. That actually,
yeah, I started flicking through that again today. I mean, two things that maybe we can then backtrack a little bit, but on what Derick said. I mean, I think, and I must admit, I don't know Lasch anywhere near as well as I know Genovese, and certainly not as well as you two do. But I think the materialist analysis continues in a lot of Lasch's work when I think it departs in Genovese's. And even though Lasch has these kind of conservative moments in conservative writings, there's never this clear break. I mean, for listeners, in 1994, Genovese writes this kind of article in Dissent called The Question, which is a very clear, I'm leaving the left kind of denunciation. I've made a clear break. And I don't know if we ever see something as obvious as that with Lasch, at least publicly.
Mm-hmm.
So let us start. I mean, Robin Kelly, the historian, as we were saying before we pressed record, considers Genovese's contributions to the study of U.S. history in the South, slavery in the South, to be equivalent to E.P. Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, which is an incredible statement. But he's a pariah, right? He's an outsider, and he has this baggage because the left, basically, he got in such vociferous fights with the new left, which kind of looks different now, now that we have the post left and we have this whole podcast thing and the kind of Red Scare, the whole coherence of the left is once again in a very turbulent state today. So talk about this odd figure who was bringing a Gramscian analysis of the slave condition in a series of works. Who was he? What's his background? His a working class background, right?
Yeah. So Eugene Genovese, or Gene Genovese, as he's kind of known throughout his life, he's born in 1930 in Brooklyn, working class, first generation Italian American family. So he grows up, during the Depression. His dad is out of work and effectively is trying to find somewhere to focus his energy and hate about what is happening during the Depression. And at 15 in 1945, he reads the Communist Manifesto and he joins the Communist Party of the United States at a time in New York where obviously there is a slight decline, but there is still a vibrant Communist Party. And he's in the Communist Party for about 5 years, where he starts going to Brooklyn College, which is another kind of hotbed of radicalism. And actually in 1950, he's expelled from the Communist Party. Mm-hmm. He famously says, I zigged when I should have zagged, kind of, makes out this narrative that he kind of rebelled. It's still something I'm trying to work through, trying to find actually sources to see why he was expelled. But he's kicked out of the Communist Party in 1950, but he remains a Marxist. And he ends up going and studying at Columbia, which is kind of one of the premier history departments in the country, both then and now. And somewhere along the way, I think it's actually an undergrad, someone says to him, if you really want to put these like Marxist ideas to the test, if you really want to see how a ruling class rules, study Southern slave owners. That's, a real test of like looking into how slave owners as a way of looking at how a ruling class maintains power. So he goes to Columbia in the 1950s, he graduates, and he becomes one of the most influential historians of slavery and Southern antebellum history, probably the most influential in the second half of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about many of Genovese's central claims, and we can talk about what those are highly contested today. And many of them are, I would say, not the popular take within the academy and have been pushed back on, but they still kind of set the terms of debate amongst historians, right? The questions that he raised, some of the most important questions that Genovese was known for was Southern slavery capitalist? That was one of the huge debates that he started. He argued emphatically not, and we can talk about the Marxist kind of lens that he brought to that, as well as some of the Marxist critiques. But that is still one of the biggest debates amongst historians of slavery today was Southern slavery capitalist. Another is this debate about slave agency and slave resistance. Were Southern slaves revolutionary agents? That's another kind of question which still resonates really strongly today. These are things that he brought in. But the one thing that I will really say is that before Genovese came on the scene, a lot of historians, what was called the kind of consensus school of historians, they believed that the Civil War had been a moral calamity that could have been averted if there was better statesmancraft, basically. If politicians hadn't made bad decisions, the Civil War could have been averted. And Genovese is really one of the people who comes along and goes, no, this is a fundamental struggle between different economic systems and different social systems that is kind of unavoidable. There's a materialist analysis that he brings to the causes of the Civil War that kind of overturns this idea that, maybe if we just had better policy history, then the Civil War would have been averted, kind of thing. And feel free to jump in at any time, but I'll say a couple of things about his Marxist approach to history. One thing, even before his approach, is that he really forced mainstream historians, by which I mean conservative and liberal historians, mainly the people who were in the academy before the 1960s, to take Marxist scholarship seriously. There's obviously Marxist scholars before that, Herbert Abthecker, W.B. Du Bois, the Foners, that being Philip and Jack Foner, not Eric Foner's a little bit later, who had produced Marxist scholarship in 30s, 40s, and 50s. But they really had been sidelined. And we can talk about some of the causes of that. But Genovese, the real one who breaks through and forces these kind of mainstream conservative and liberal historians to take his arguments seriously. In 1978, he's elected to the head of the Organization of American Historians. That's the most kind of prominent historical association of American historians, first explicit Marxist to be elected to that. And the book that Robin Kelly kind of references as the parallel to Thompson's The Making of the English Working Class, Roll, Jordan, Roll, that comes out in 1974. That wins the Bancroft Prize. That's the most prestigious prize in American history. So it's another example of an explicitly Marxist text kind of winning the most prestigious prize within the broader academy. So this is someone, even before we can talk about the theory, the Marxist theories he's bringing, really is actually forcing non-Marxist historians not just to kind of sideline Marxism, and they are forced to engage with it.
So one of the big things on agency that we can focus on here, that he's known for, and that I think has, had major ripple effects up to today, is the positioning of the centrality of the Bible and of Christianity in the kind of backdrop. And I want to ask you, how Gramsci fits into that. You know what I mean? Religion as some kind of superstructural force for agency, but also he's also known for the paternalism argument.
Right.
Is the paternalism argument to be understood as a kind of pessimistic claim on agency? Or not?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about it that way. So let's...
You understand what I mean by pessimistic?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
There's no revolutionary possibility because...
Yes.
And then that also actually leaks into the question about capitalism.
Right.
Because if this is not a capitalist class relation, he's using this word paternalism, which is a kind of neo-feudal term.
Right. So let's take paternalism first, and then we'll move to Gramsci, right? So on the paternalism thesis, Genovese's central kind of unifying... The thing that he really takes from Marx, I think, is that if you want to understand any society, you look at the social relations within it. Not the relations of exchange, not the relationships between people and commodities. You analyze the relationships between classes of people. And his argument is that if you bring that to the study of the American South, you realize there is a completely different set of social relations between enslaver and enslaved than exists in the North at that time, where you have a wage labor system dominated by employer and employee. He says that those aren't compatible as modes of production, right? And from this, when he uses paternalism, and I think there is a lot of problems with the paternalism thesis, but what he is thinking of is not kind of an indirect, faraway rule that we might think of as in kind of free market capitalism, but a very direct, personal, kind of coercive type of rule. I mean, slave owners are in the lives of their enslaver, of the enslaved a lot of the time. I mean, you obviously have absent owners, but enslaved people know their owners. It's a different type of society to Genovese than operates under capitalist societies. So this paternalism thesis, I think, is trying to grapple with what is the relationship between enslaved people and enslavers. And one of his arguments is there's almost this kind of that enslaved people take on some dependency from their enslavers. They take on even maybe some of the values and culture of their enslavers without fully kind of capitulating to slavery. And they make kind of tangible wins within that. So acts of resistance, they win certain gains from their employers within this kind of very personal, but deeply unbalanced relationship. A lot of historians have come along and said that he deeply underestimates the impact of both violence and force to kind of uphold that, and that some of the kind of hegemony that's kind of the kind of Gramscian idea of there's this kind of cultural framework in which resistance and violence isn't happening, it is not actually the truth, that there's much more force required to uphold it. But that's kind of part of the paternalism thesis, which I think kind of neatly moves us in some way to thinking about the Gramsci argument. One thing that I think is important here, and listeners may know this, but Gramsci is not particularly well read in the United States, really until the 1960s. And he's not translated into English in much of that period. Genovese is actually in the military in the early 1950s. He's discharged.
He learned Italian to read Gramsci.
Right, exactly.
Right?
He learns Italian in the military before he's discharged so that he can learn Gramsci. And he writes this important article in 1967 in Studies on the Left, which is a really important kind of flagship left-wing journal at that time called On Antonio Gramsci. And so he's looking at kind of hegemony in a scholarship way, right? How does ruling class power depend on its ability to convince other classes to effectively buy into society at large? And I think the paternalism thesis, his argument is to some extent that enslaved people do that in part. And I think that's where some of the criticism comes from. And that's why there isn't this kind of revolutionary tradition, in his view, that happens in North American slavery. But I think it's worth noting that he sees Gramsci as very, very important in the broader project to the left, outside of his own scholarship. He thinks it is one thing that he takes from Gramsci is effectively, how do you create socialism in a country where industrial capitalism has already happened? How do you the kind of Gramscian idea that in areas of the West, socialism would not come through violent revolution, but kind of through this kind of long, protracted cultural fight. And so he sees this idea of kind of cultural hegemony that he takes from Gramsci as being integral to the left. He thinks this is going to be a long, kind of drawn out war, not necessarily a physically violent one, in which how does the left win over the working class to its project? Right. And so that's where the Gramscian kind of side comes into his politics. And I think which increasingly, alongside the class dimensions of it that we should touch on, alienates him from elements of the new left, which really kind of see a revolutionary potential at that moment in the 1960s, see the campuses as an area of revolutionary potential, and see the working class. And this, I don't want to generalize all of the new left, because I don't think this is true, but there's sections of the new left which just think the working class in the US is completely sold out, and see students as being kind of the revolutionary alternative.
I want to invite Derick to jump in here, but and I do want to actually focus, because you see, Genovese and Lasch are strange creatures of American Marxism, because they're both critics of the old left and the new left.
Right.
They, you know what I mean? Like the mechanistic Stalinist version of this CPUSA that he was kicked out of, Genovese is kicked out of, they had no place for Gramsci. I mean, the journal they were going to call, one of the alternative titles to Marxist Perspectives was March Through the Institutions.
Long March.
Long March.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, because Gramsci, the new left, is supposedly the kind of owners of the Gramscian idea in some sense. But, yeah, go ahead.
Well, interestingly, as a side note to both of you, I'm doing a lot of research into Italian communism in the early 20th century right now. So, and I'm sort of knee deep in this. But Gramsci's, it's interesting what Gramsci represents in America versus what he represents in, say, Italy, where he is resurrected kind of piecemeal by Togliatti as a way to like justify the Popular Front and get in the rebirth of the PCI and resistance war footing, like the communists in France. And part of that was partly because Togliatti is not particularly charismatic, and Gramsci's writing he himself was not particularly. But I find it interesting that he was not actually used for that in America in the 1950s. I was going through like American communist writings from the 50s, and you're right. Not only is Gramsci not translated, which kind of makes sense. Like Gramsci doesn't even get published in Italy until 1944. It's like it gets into Italy through this weird way where Togliatti like gets the prison notebooks from Moscow somehow, and then like they get kind of published in selections. And for those of you who don't know, the prison notebooks are still not completely available in English. Buttigieg, as in Pete's father, didn't finish. So it is such an interesting thing that we have so much secondary material on Gramsci, but we don't actually even have all the primary material in English today. But I find it interesting because in America, Gramsci actually is associated with a completely different valence. So it's not part of this like resistance to war in World War II, Popular Front, patriotic socialism with a small p and a small s. In the United States, he has a completely different valence, and he doesn't. And I was surprised, also, ironically, not because of my Lasch research, but because of my Italian communism research, learning that Genovese is one of the first people who popularizes him in the U.S. As part of this moment in the New Left. And the New Left in this time period, I mean, everyone's going it. We have to kind of periodize the New Left and the early New Left and then the New Communist Movement, because the New Communist Movement doesn't have the hostility towards workers that the early New Left does. Mm-hmm. But going back through all this material, Genovese and Lasch are both really pushing back on this idea that the students and the intellectual class can be by themselves a revolutionary subject or a new subject for politics. Although it's that Gramsci in turn and Genovese seems to be that he's a little bit more open to it. And another thing that's interesting about Genovese is you get to his 1990s writings, which are all like the agrarians were right. For those of you who don't know Southern history, the agrarians are basically they're not quite neo-Confederates, but they're close. So it's like neo-Confederacism without the slavery and without the explicit, although definitely implicit, white supremacy. Genovese brings Gramsci into that too, which is part of this like right-wingification of Gramsci that you might see in someone like DeSantis today. So he's interesting I think Genovese is actually part of why Gramsci is such a interesting touchstone talking point on the right, probably as much as he is on the left. Like you hear them talking about Gramsci all the time. So I don't know. That's a lot at once, but there's kind of two things there. One is you have Genovese as a defender of the working class is still kind of a viable political subject in the context of the New Left that's largely walking away from it. And then two, you have this cultural hegemony as something we should aim for, including if we're using it to repopularize Southern agrarianism in the 1990s.
Right. I mean, and one thing I was just thinking about is that one thing, though, that unites the kind of Lasch and Genovese critique of both the old left and the new left is this kind of focus on, there's a criticism of the old left, which is there was a kind of romanticization of workers and the exploited and the oppressed, right? That if you look at a lot of the kind of material produced within the CPUSA in the 40s and the 50s, it's kind of these, triumphant stories of revolutionary victory. It's written with very clear political purpose. So Herbert Aptheker, who's the famous communist historian, has this line that like history's might is potent, like the oppressed need it, to create power. the oppressors need it to maintain power. Like Genovese and Lasch have very little time for that kind of romanticization. And I think we actually level that critique at the New Left as well by seeing the New Left, elements of the New Left, who are really focused on creating relevant scholarship. The idea that scholarship must be inherently relevant to the current struggle, that it must be written in a very particular way to address the needs of the political movement at the time. And I think in both of those cases, Genovese and Lasch, while obviously admitting that one cannot be completely ideologically removed from any project, complete objectivity is impossible. But they see that as kind of uniting feature between old and new left, in that this kind of focus on relevance and making the work immediately available for the political struggle.
And for Lasch, it would be the Frankfurt School more than it would be Gramsci.
Yes.
Precisely because I think the Frankfurt School could temper the vulgar, heroistic, or sort of, old left approach to the question of revolution, which was quite economistic and maybe you could say even class reductionist.
Yeah.
In that regard, Lasch is swimming in the waters of Freudian Marxism, which is trying to render the whole question of the revolutionary subject sort of to put it in suspense, to put it into question, but he's not, but he's still going to have an allegiance, unlike, say, Herbert Marcuse, right, to the working class as the fundamental agency that somehow is being lost in the fervor of
I mean, as early as 1969, you see Lasch pushing back on the tendency of the Frankfurt School to write off the working class. Like you see it in World of Nations. He talks about it explicitly, but he's still coming out of that framework. So what I find interesting, and I was going to ask you, because I've read like 2 Genovese books, or 3. I've read The Southern Tradition, which I've read Roll Children Roll and From Rebellion to Revolution, about the revolutionary, what he sees as the revolutionary slave revolts as opposed to the North American slave culture, which is an interest. I mean, I find that to be a fundamentally interesting question, in so much that, like, part of the question that's in Genovese's head is, why does the United States not go Haiti? But it seems that they kind of get back into the thing. It seems like while the Frankfurt School is a touchstone for Lasch, he's also eminently critiquing it for its abandoning of the working class. Is there a similar eminent critique of Gramsci in Genovese that I don't know about?
I don't think so, because I think he sees using Gramsci as a model of how you win over the working class, right? That it's a long, protracted struggle in which you win working class people over through basically, building political power and institutions and showing that you are a serious political project, I think, as part of it. I don't know if either of you read Lasch. So Lasch and Genovese had a book that they wrote together that never got published.
A critique of the New Left.
Critique of the New Left, yeah. And
it was something called, wasn't it called Against the New Left?
Yeah, I literally think it is.
It was very strong. Yeah.
But they write an article which I think was part of it, which is The Education in the University We Need Now. And that is about 1970, and it's about campus politics, basically, right? And they are trying to kind of put forward these alternatives to the protests that are happening on university campuses in the late 1960s. And one thing that I do think that is lacking in Genovese, even though there is him pointing towards this kind of Gramscian alternative, is there really isn't this project that he is able to offer as an alternative. The big thing that the Genoveses argue is, instead of kind of campus politics, we should be going door to door, creating petitions as signatures against the war in Vietnam. That'll be a way of building solidarity between students and workers. That seems, I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but it seems quite lacking in class analysis compared to some of their other kind of thinking. And I think they are actually, at least Genovese I see, even though I think really vibrant in lots of ways, doesn't manage to find a real alternative political project that can be offered to the new left, if that makes sense.
So we should try to get a little more specific. So what's interesting is there's a couple campuses that are known as the kind of Marxist flagship campuses. And the first is Madison, Wisconsin.
Yes.
And my understanding is that the strategy of the teach-in was kind of invented on that campus by Marxist historians. Is that correct? And was that also a attempt to do exactly what you're talking about during Vietnam, which is this kind of like, because you see, I think in the background here is the question of the proper politicization function of the intellectual, which is a classic problem of Marxism. And it's even more pronounced as a problem in American contexts,
right?
For, you know, a number of reasons having to do with the fact that we lack a vibrant public sphere for intellectual exchange, say like the equivalent of France does, right? Like there's something missing in that domain, in my opinion. And I feel that it's interesting because both Genovese and Lasch were saying, look, the new left is trying to exaggerate the political function of professors. We actually, as professors, should remain sort of politically neutral. But have our politics function outside of the university is maybe one way to summarize it. So could you speak, Gabriel, more generally, you know, to that, to sort of what their vision is, right? What is their vision of what a Marxist intellectual should do in America, if that makes sense? I feel like that's kind of, even before the journal starts, right? This is sort of their headspace. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And so, and we can, you know, so you touched on Wisconsin, which in the kind of late 1950s becomes kind of the hub of kind of new Marxist thought in the US. One reason is that just McCarthyism does not have as much power at Wisconsin. Not as many of the faculty get fired there, but it kind of creates around the graduate seminar of one particular faculty member, William Appleton Williams, is a load of kind of left-wing graduate students emerge who start a journal, and that becomes a kind of center. This journal studies on the left, a kind of center of thought. But the one university we should probably, particularly on this question, look at is Rutgers University in 1965, where Eugene Genovese gets a job there. I think he's been teaching at Brooklyn Polytechnic, and then he moves to Rutgers. In 1965, there's these teach-ins against the Vietnam War all across the US, including very prominent ones at Rutgers. And Genovese comes out and is teaching. I don't know what the actual history class he teaches the teaching, but he says, I welcome a Viet Cong victory in the war. This very explicit statement of not just do I want America out of Vietnam, I want the Viet Cong to win. And this becomes the single biggest issue in the gubernatorial race in New Jersey that year. I mean, and that's not an exaggeration. There are just calls all over for Genovese to be fired from the university. He is not fired, but there is a clear behind the scenes. If you stay, you're not going to get tenure. You're not going to get, you know, pay increases, those kind of things. And he eventually leaves. So, you know, he is involved in this teach-in anti-war movement, but he then starts to see students turn on the university as a space of critical thought. And in many ways, I think there are good reasons for why they do. I mean, there are prominent left-wing faculty members who are blacklisted from the academy, even as late as the 1960s. There are concerns about weapon, you know, certain napalm being built, you know, within universities where research is going, where trustees' money is coming from. There are kind of real critical concerns, I think, about the university, but he sees it as political suicide for the left to turn on the university. It should be this non-ideological space of where ideas can be debated.
Did you, one question I had, how do you interpret his statement? Kind of goes back to Derick's point about a statement that he made. Is that a kind of personality flaw in your interpretation? Or is there a certain sincerity? Because I've heard him speak before, and I didn't get the impression that he's like a blowhard per se. Is he a blowhard? Is that what this is? Or was he actually sort of putting forward a kind of logical argument about why the Viet Cong should win?
That's a great question. I don't know. I would need to go back and look. I mean, he speaks in very often aggressive militaristic kind of language. So I think in that sense, that kind of big statement makes a lot of sense with him. I mean, and one moment we should, within this conversation that's relevant, is in maybe the kind of key early break is in 1969. The American Historical Association meets, and the radical historians, the historians on the left, try and put forward a motion to get this big historical association to condemn the war in Vietnam. And Genovese kind of goes in and sides with the liberal and conservative forces within the academy to have this motion voted down within the historical meeting. And no one used to go to the business meeting. The previous year in 1968, 116 people went. 2,000 go to the business meeting. In 1969, the vote on this motion of whether the American Historical Association should condemn the war in Vietnam. And there's a lot of new left anger towards him when this goes down. But the other thing is, he stands there in the debate, in the room during this motion, and says, put them down hard, and put them down once and for all. Kind of talking about the figures within the left who want the organization to condemn the war. So I think this kind of very kind of aggressive militaristic language like that is actually much more in line with how Genovese was as a person.
Sorry if I interrupted you before,
No,
but I feel that's important, and
yeah,
people should learn more about this figure. I mean, clearly he is for the history of the American left. He's not talked about much. I mean, Lasch is talked about. Everyone knows Lasch. Lasch is a household name. I feel like Genovese is kind of not anymore.
Yeah.
But in a certain way, he in his time was such a central figure in so many different ways. So we talked about Genovese's historical contributions. I guess, is there anything else we wanted to touch on there? Did we sort of touched everything with one exception? I don't know, Derick, if you agree, but we didn't really. Could you summarize, perhaps, Gabriel, Genovese's claim that the South was not capitalist pre-Civil War?
Yes.
What exactly does that mean?
So he tempers this along the way. So I think that kind of by the 1980s, he is saying that Southern slave owners were of the capitalist world, but not in it. Or it might even be they were in the capitalist world, but not of it, or of the capitalist world and not in it, right? They of course, are involved in international capitalist markets. No one could dispute that. But the way society is organized in the South is fundamentally different to a wage labor system. And he thinks that's more important than anything else, basically. So that's the kind of and he thinks that the culture, and this I think links to some of the stuff about Southern agrarians that we can touch on later, and the kind of the Southern conservative tradition, is that out of the South emerges this kind of anti-bourgeois culture. And I think this is actually a through line between the earlier Genovese and potentially some of that later kind of embrace of Southern conservatism, is he's always looking for something against liberalism, or something against what he sees as kind of bourgeois individualism, which he sees as kind of what the North is about. I mean, I am not hugely convinced by that argument anymore. I think it probably oversells the kind of anti-capitalist nature of a lot of the slave owning class. But that's the kind of key area. The one thing
you're suggesting is if I get this right, that through his deep historical immersion into the kind of latent critique of liberalism that emerged from the culture of the ruling class and its intellectuals in the South, you're suggesting that Genovese incorporates in some form an influence of an anti-liberalism from that site, or from that. Is that right? Is that kind of your...
Well, or to put it a different way. So there's a great quote by Leo Rabutho, who's a historian who died relatively recently, who used to say, I always used to tease Gene that he hated liberalism more than he loves socialism, right? And I think inherent within Genovese from the beginning is this deep kind of distaste for what he sees as bourgeois culture, but also kind of just liberalism more broadly. And socialism, for the majority of his life, I think, is the vehicle by which he sees as the political expression of that. And we can talk maybe a little bit.
So liberalism for Genovese would be defined as bourgeois ideology and
bourgeois ideology and individualism, right? I think that's the kind of the center. And then cultural radicalism for him is an outgrowth of that, because
so this is atomized individualism,
yes.
right? Anti-communitarian,
Exactly.
anti-solidaristic, capitalist. Okay, I think I'm getting the gist.
And to Derick's earlier point, and is that I think that's why once socialism collapses for him as a political project, he embraces this kind of what he sees as this kind of Southern agrarian, Southern conservative tradition, which has is a kind of very defensive of private property, but is more skeptical of the free market, and particularly the kind of excesses of what it sees of kind of a consumer culture or a kind of individualist culture that comes out of free market capitalism. He sees that then as the kind of continuation of his kind of anti-individualism, anti-bourgeois culture. And so I think there is a kind of clear through line, not just a break there.
So then my final question, I'll turn it back to Derick, is what then is Christianity for him in American context, like in a Southern context? Like, is Christianity is not necessarily anti-revolutionary, or is it? Or is Christianity, you know what I'm saying? Like, how would he?
Can I intervene in that a little bit? Because I would actually say you need to ask more than just Christianity. You need to ask why Catholicism.
Yeah.
Why? I mean, Genovese, interestingly, again, weird overlaps in history, and like Genovese was a name that I was a little bit more familiar with, because my own personal history as a half Jewish, half Scotch-Irish Catholic in the Deep South. The agrarian tradition, weirdly, is overwhelmingly Catholic, even though Southern planters were not. And that's like you see that in Alan Tate, the famous poet who wrote For the Confederate Dead. You see it in John Crow Ransom. You see it in David Donaldson. And to bring into this kind of prefigure to the Southern agrarians, that it's kind of important to this argument that I think Genovese makes, although I don't remember him citing him, is George Fitzhugh.
He writes an entire book, a section of the book on Fitzhugh.
Yeah, like I'm trying to remember, like, but Fitzhugh is the first person who argues that I know of that Southern society is not capitalist, explicitly. That's both Campbell's Law and Sociology for the South, which is the first usage of the term sociology in English, I believe, or at least in a book title. It's pretty close. Fitzhugh writes that basically no, we're not bourgeois. We reflect an earlier tradition, and that earlier tradition is of the good elements of feudal aristocracy. The planters, care for their serfs, in this case black slaves, who are also racially inferior, but that's not even the point he's making. I find that very interesting today. I mean, when you talk about like the new histories of slavery, because we have to remind ourselves that, like, okay, Genovese's upturning a 40s, 50s tradition interpretation of the Civil War and slavery. We have upturned today in like new slavery history the Genovese consensus that it was not capitalist. I think the interesting thing is, from the standpoint of the relationship between the slaveholder and the slave, it isn't capitalist. I actually think that that's true. From the standpoint of this role in primitive accumulation, that's a harder, more murkier question. And I think, like, if I'm remembering Genovese correctly, and I haven't read Roll Jordan Roll in like 20 years, he does over his life, like, realize he's got to deal with the fact that it was instituted in this larger thing about this larger capitalist complex. I think he's also he becomes more familiar with Marx's writings on the Civil War, which were not very well known of or read in the 50s and 60s either.
But But remember, even in his late interviews on Marx's writings on the Civil War, he's very dismissive of them.
And
Remember that he basically says, "Yeah, Marx didn't know anything about the U.S."
And he actually says that as early as the late 1960s. He basically accuses Marx of being a liberal when it comes to the American Civil War and his analysis of it. It's kind of fascinating.
It's just basically like he's trusting his Republican newspaper publishers way too much about what's going on, basically. Like
but maybe we could go back. So you could put Catholicism, Protestantism in the context of the South for Genovese might be the question, Gabriel.
Yeah, and so I think there's a couple of just contextual personal things that happen. His wife, Elizabeth Fox Genovese, who Derick, someone else you might have come across, she's actually the one who gets the job at Embry, and then he eventually comes along and teaches at various Georgia schools.
Genovese is a spousal hire kind
of. She takes over the women's studies program there and kind of becomes very prominent because of her, either whether you want to see it as anti-feminist or kind of conservative feminist politics. She makes that a kind of key area for conversation and becomes a kind of cultural warrior. So she converts to Catholicism first. So I think that obviously has its influence. But there's something else that's really interesting that, this is why I'm still interested very much in Derick and your thoughts of like why Catholicism, because one thing, Genovese starts writing about the religion of the enslavers a lot more in the 80s and 90s. And one of his big arguments is that the pro-slavery theologians were the ones who were the most theoretically and intellectually rigorous. That's like his central argument. He's like, even if they were wrong, they are the ones who most effectively like utilize the Bible, like pushing back on this narrative that the abolitionists really effectively kind of utilize the Bible. And he actually kind of says mainstream liberal Protestants have kind of abandoned all their kind of church traditions. This is why he's still an atheist, or supposedly an atheist. And so it is interesting, I think, beyond even the fact that it's his wife who converts first, that he also joins the Catholic Church. One thing that he says, and I don't know if it's in the interview I sent you guys, but I think it's really interesting. He says, Catholicism is not a democracy. It has a hierarchy, and he effectively says, that's what I want in my religion. If you want a kind of pluralistic, democratic religion, go and join the Baptists or someone else. But he says, I'm not interested in that. I like this kind of like ordered hierarchy. And so maybe that's another reason. I mean, he's a big proponent of Pope Benedict, Ratzinger. So yeah, I think the question of Catholicism, as opposed to a different religious tradition. I mean, he is Catholic. He is an Italian American. He was Catholic until he was 15. So there is kind of that return. But I think within itself, it's still a really
well. I guess it's hard for me to take sincere a lot of Genovese's late religious turn, because it is so overloaded with the fact that the majority of his life, he is such a, if the right word, I don't know if it's the right word, faithful Marxist. So in other words, is it a kind of ressentiment or a kind of resentment against the left? Yeah, if Catholicism is hierarchical and all of these infantile students that have tried to call me a fascist and tried to get me fired and tried to do this and do that. I mean, he's a product of what we today call cancel culture, right? He's one of an early product of that. And I can't help but seeing his late essays and lectures as a sort of a resentful response to that.
Oh, definitely.
And I always felt like he's overshadowed, or that it overdetermines the sincerity of his positions there. But I also wanted to ask you how, I was actually more wondering what the subversive power of religion is in his understanding of the agency of people enslaved in the United States. That was more of my question.
Oh,
yeah. So if we return,
not so much for him, I was more thinking in his historical intellectual interpretation. That was my question.
It's why he becomes interested in later on, in part as well. So in the late, in his work in the 60s, Political Economy of Slavery, and the book that is escaping me, writes in the late 1960s, there's not a lot of focus on religion of the enslaved. And he actually receives a lot of critical feedback, particularly from African-American scholars who have been focusing on slave religion in the 1960s and 1970s. And he really starts to interrogate that and realizes that he thinks it's missing in his earlier scholarship. So a ton of Roll, Jordan, Roll looks at the way in which enslaved people were able to take elements of Christianity and kind of use it against the slave owners, even though it was being imposed on them. He sees it as a very powerful tool of resistance. He says it doesn't create a revolutionary tradition, but it is a form of resistance that enslaved people are able to utilize. And one of the ways he's actually criticized by other scholars is that he focuses too much on Christianity and not enough on potentially other religious traditions that enslaved people may have maintained from Africa. That's one of the critiques,
or even Islam, right?
Or Islam, yes, exactly.
What does he say again about Nat Turner? I'm trying to remember.
The Nat Turner, that's
significant there. Please, yeah.
It's a whole really interesting other debate on Nat Turner. Maybe, should we go there or not?
If you don't mind, I know that it's probably an important digression.
I mean,
I know it's related, obviously.
So in 1967, William Styron writes this famous novel about Nat Turner, which becomes a kind of huge firestorm. And Styron is seen as kind of infanticizing Turner. One of the things is that Turner has this kind of, within the novel, has this relationship with a white woman, which there wasn't any historical evidence for. And so a lot of writers, particularly African-American writers, push back and say that Styron took way too many liberties in kind of this historical novel. And so Genovese actually writes all these defenses of Styron and says people are just kind of canceling him because he's a Southern white guy, and we should defend him because he brought Turner back to the forefront, which isn't necessarily true. There's obviously was a tradition of keeping the kind of memory of Nat Turner alive. But he starts to think more about Nat Turner. So the original title for Roll, Jordan, Roll is actually Sambo and Nat Turner. Sambo was this kind of racist generalization idea of an enslaved person as kind of docile who would never revolt. So Roll, Jordan, Roll is trying to kind of think about the kind of dialectical difference, right, between the kind of the docility and the revolutionary enslaved person. But I think that he I think obviously acknowledges Turner's use of religion, but I don't think that I think he sees Turner as not an example of the majority of enslaved people, right? That kind of revolutionary Christian tradition that people kind of saw in Turner, I don't think he sees in the majority of enslaved people.
So he's an aberration, right?
Yes.
But he's not reducible, I don't know, to some kind of psychologization per se.
Yes.
So there was a potential. Well, anyway, we don't need to go down that rabbit hole. That's a big rabbit hole. But perhaps you could continue back in your thread about saying a few more things regarding, his general or interpretation of, or maybe you've already encapsulated it adequately. I don't know.
No, I mean, all I would say is that I think this focus on religion of the enslaved makes him think more critically about religion in the long run. I wouldn't say that that's the reason I'm not suggesting that's the reason he becomes Catholic, but I think he starts to see the importance of religion much more than he does potentially earlier on.
So as a resident right-wing whisperer, I want to go a little bit into the agrarians and Catholicism in specific. Yeah. One of the reasons why the agrarians are attracted to Catholicism is
can you tell people who the agrarians are quickly?
The Southern agrarians were a group of Southerners who wrote a manifesto in 1930. They were mostly an artistic and cultural critical movement. They would have other people associated with them in the conservative movement, like William Weaver and
Richard Weaver.
Yeah, Richard Weaver, not William Weaver. Who wrote Ideas Have Consequences. That's his most famous book. And they were led by a mixture of pro-South historians and poets. So that tells you a lot. But one of the things that they were influenced by, quite frankly, was de Maistre, Marat, Charles Marat, and T.H. Eliot. And they saw the degradations of the South as being tied into urbanism and industrialism and modernity, which led them to take the Max Weber thesis about Protestants' contribution to capitalism quite seriously. So a lot of them converted to Catholicism. Some of them were born Catholics too, but a lot of them converted because they thought it was a way around the Protestant orientation towards capitalism, even though they were mostly out of Protestant societies. So if you think about like the children of these people, as far as like people, most people have not read John Core Ransom or Alan Tate today, but they have read Flannery O'Connor and John Kennedy Toole and people like that, who are not agrarians. They don't go as far as the agrarians did, but they are sympathetic to them. I think the most famous agrarian I haven't mentioned is Robert Penn Warren, but Robert Penn Warren very much tamps down on his, pro Confederacy stances throughout his career. He becomes the least reactionary of the bunch.
So this is like a southern literati, early 20th century bohemian, but sophisticated enough to renounce the embedded white supremacy of or no.
It depends on which ones you're talking about.
Yeah.
So like some of them did, some of them didn't. Another thing that a lot of them glommed onto was Pope Pius the Ninth, Pio Nono, because Pio Nono was initially sympathetic to the Confederacy, but ended up supporting the Confederacy and thus throwing the Catholic Church's weight behind it because of the slavery issue. So there's this idea, well, if we hadn't have been slavers, our way of life was more noble and we would have been able to maintain it. And it's a more proper way of life anyway. But there are some explicit white supremacists in the group. So we shouldn't totally like drop that out of there. And they're also, they're influenced by some of the most reactionary, some would even say proto-fascist elements of like neo-medievalism and reactionary thought in Europe. I mean, it's hard to not be considered sketch when your major influence is de Maistre. So that's part of it. One of the interesting things I think, and this is theorizations on my part, but what might have made it attractive to make Catholicism in specific attracted to Genovese is that one of the things that a lot of the agrarians push for is Catholic distributism. So they are very into Catholic distributism. And from the New Left or proto-New Left perspective, that wasn't even that far. And Dorothy Day is a distributist, the left-wing version of it. But for people who might be more familiar with it, that's like the political economy, in quotation marks, of people like G.K. Chesterton in England. So like, that's one of the things to think about, that the agrarians were and saw themselves as anti-capitalist, but from the right, and they weren't as they did not see themselves as like fascist. Although I think some of them were kind of fascist sympathizers, but like
you're sort of saying, and Gabriel, I want your take. Is Varn is kind of saying that we could understand the Genovese, both of them. Elizabeth Fox Genovese and Jean, as kind of this sort of paradoxical post-Marxist sort of inheritors of sort of late, I guess by like the 1980s, they sort of have some kind of return to something like that. Or
yes.
Are you also, is that kind of fair to say?
Yeah, and I mean, and this isn't just an intellectual project. I mean, I think actually this happens to happen from the 1970s onwards, but particularly once they moved to the South, many of these kind of Southern conservatives who kind of come out of the Southern agrarian tradition are the people that they are socializing and kind of bringing into their intellectual orbit. This isn't just like them kind of repeating this argument. Genovese becomes particularly close to Emmy Bradford, who's kind of one of these kind of key Southern conservatives who comes out of this tradition, and other figures. There's a moment in 1990 where Genovese kind of gathers different people at his home, including a lot of these Southern conservatives who come out of the Southern agrarian tradition and figures on the left who he's still close to, and tries to get them to kind of like build a political project that can move past both free market capitalism and on the right, and where he sees the kind of new left kind of cultural radicalism as having taken over the left. Apparently, this meeting is a complete and utter disaster. Genovese's solution is they all get behind Pat Buchanan. But, you know, what the thing that they take away from that is, even though I think most of us would accept that as an intellectual project is probably flawed, and I think probably, you know, many of the Southern conservatives would also think that, Genovese sees that as a real opportunity, at least as late as 1990, that he would see that there are sane sections of the right and sane sections of the left who he can kind of bring together in this kind of anti-bourgeois, communitarian kind of tradition. And it simply doesn't work.
Amazing. Yeah.
I think another figure who tried something like that was Wendell Berry, and Wendell Berry just ended up dropping the conservatism eventually. So,
all right. So we've been talking for about an hour.
One very quick thing before we should probably actually move on to the journal with Lasch. But
the journal, yes,
is that one other thing that we do see with the Southern, some of these Southern conservatives, is that they have a little bit of that paleo-con kind of anti-war focus within them, right? So several of these people who kind of Genovese is close to by the early 1990s don't support the first Gulf War. They come up very strongly against Bush there. So I think there's that kind of paleo conservatism going on. He's very close to Paul Gottfried as well. And it's only,
I knew that I invited Derick Varn here for a reason.
And it's only in the...
He knows something about these people.
Okay, great. It's only in the 2000s that we see Genovese really embracing a more mainstream conservative foreign policy approach. So by the late 2010, he gives a speech at CPAC, which is just complete defense of the war on terror. That is not the conservative Genovese of the early 90s, at least in my reading. So I think that transition happened as well. But yeah, I'll let
no, I was about to say, I always read Genovese as shifting from paleo conservatism and being friendly to even some really sketchy peoples like Sam T. Francis.
Yes.
If you don't know who that is, he got kicked out of the National Review along with Joe Sobran for being too racist. And also wrote a book called The New Leviathan that was not published in his lifetime. It's been published recently by a parafascist press. But Paul Gottfried is interesting because Paul Gottfried's another one of these weird figures. Gottfried had a relationship to Telios magazine. He was a student of Marcuse. He's also the teacher of Richard Spencer, which is kind of his claim to fame today. And he's always writing like, well, Nazism was bad, but fascism maybe not be so bad though. Which I know that sounds completely unfair, but he wrote a book about fascism and anti-fascism. It was like, well, you know, the Hitler parts, that's bad, and we don't like genocide, that's bad, but Mussolini maybe not so bad. But Gottfried's an interesting figure. Gottfried is he was the person who published a whole lot of the European New Right at a ostensibly Frankfurt School journal. I believe it's either late 80s or early 1990s. And so there's all this weird sort of paleocon left intersection that Genovese's part of. Genovese's the period of Genovese I know him from was the period I was in school, which so I was at relatively close school, so his shenanigans were like gossip where I was at. I'm from Georgia. Was his shift from Pat Buchanan right into straight up George Bush right before he died, and that was actually sort of shocking to the paleocons and the kind of like the kind of the anti-Gulf War people, like some of whom were basically neo-Confederates, like Thomas Woods, who who were
Southern
like, wait,
partisan crowd.
yeah, the Southern partisan people, who were like, wait, he's not on our side anymore. He's gone full Bush. So he actually ended up, in some ways, Genovese, his last heel turn is to turn on the paleo conservatives as well. So he kind of gets a reputation for being a traitor, even on the right. So that's an interesting thing to look at for me, because I do think there's a kind of a weird spirit of resentment in him, and he is very different than Lasch, who does not. He has people like Lasch has people like what's his name from the New Criterion, Kimball's like trying to write Lasch as like a secret conservative, and in some ways Eric Miller, his biographer, is like trying to write him as a secret, as like kind of a crypto Christian. But there's no smoking gun there, and there's no like I said, even in the latest his latest interviews, which were with Telios, he's still talking about Marx and Freud, and for some reason there's some figures that are important to him that would make modern leftists uncomfortable. Like Lasch really likes George Sorel, but he's not. There's no repudiation. Even after the fall of when Lasch is speaking, when clearly the Soviet Union is falling, like, because we do have that. Whereas, I was going to ask this, maybe we can go back to 60s stuff, but how much do you think the fall of the Soviet Union plays into his full conversion to Christianity and paleoconservatism as far as Genovese goes?
I think it plays a role, but I think actually it's less the Soviet Union and more Western socialist projects collapsing that I think it's interesting because this goes back to something you said earlier. He is very invested in Italian Eurocommunism. That's the project in the 70s and the 80s he sees as the real hope. And actually, in the 70s, him and Fox Genovese go to Italy on a number of occasions and meeting with a lot of people in the Communist Party there. I think it's also not just the Soviet Union collapsing, but just other broader left projects. I also, and I mean, this is something I've grappled with trying to work through Genovese, because it kind of is so anti-materialist to think often in this way. But I do just think these personal fights really do take their toll, and I think about this in contemporary, organizing spaces as well, is that there is a lot that ends up being these huge personal fallouts, and the way people are able to accept criticisms or not.
Well, we should maybe be a little more specific, because his book was deemed a racist book,
yes,
by several reviewers, and that had a direct bearing on his career.
Yeah.
And his publishing, it had like material effects. So there's that, and that fed into what we're going to talk about in a moment, which is his so-called dictatorial leadership style,
right?
Where everyone, and Lasch included, was uncomfortable by the way that he had this kind of Manichean, you're on the inside, you're on the outside, there's these clear markers of division. I think the other thing we haven't mentioned, and this is something that comes up a lot in his interviews and when he's older, is he is a child who was traumatized in the Great Depression.
Yes.
His father was out of work for almost a year, and this was very severe. He said that his father went hungry to feed the family. And he said that when he was a Catholic, after he left Marxism, he said that Marxism gave me a vehicle for the expression of what he always called class hatred.
Yes.
And he thought that Stalinism was an engine for concentrating class hatred. And that's why he wanted to find an alternative to that, while at the same time he always seems to felt like that class hatred's real and it's pulsing through his blood, so I don't think that should ever be underestimated when we analyze this figure.
Yeah.
And that's very different than Lasch, by the way.
Yes.
Lasch came from a very not necessarily upper bourgeois family, but a very comfortable, highly educated family. Is his mother is one of the first PhDs in philosophy in America.
And his dad was a prominent newspaper editor, I think. Yeah.
Yep, that's right. So they have two different class experiences, and Eugene Genovese has this intensity from his working class life, which is from the Depression. I get it.
Yeah.
You know, I get it. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, Derick, but
well, I find it interesting because there's an intensity of this focus on the working class, but I actually would say, and I actually say this as a benefit to Genovese a little bit, that he's less likely to romanticize the working class than Christopher Lasch is, which I find interesting because when you look at Lasch's background, like, no, he's not. Lasch is not from a upper elite family in the American context, but he's definitely from an upper middle class established one. And Genovese is clearly not. And I find that interesting and somewhat telling as to where they both go. I don't know, like, what we're making of that, but there's a certain amount of like, as a Lasch scholar and a big fan of Lasch's work, but also as a person who's critical of his late work, there's like, Lasch really tries to invent a working class traditionalism to defend in a kind of quasi-Marxist vote, particularly in the late 1980s. He kind of walks this back right before he dies, but this is like his project after his big Freudian period, right? It's like, we need to talk about like working class traditionalism as something to base like a populism that was still informed by class struggle and history. Even though he's basically, Lasch is also saying, well, you know, orthodox Marxism has more or less failed, but there's still something in the Marxist core that we need to revive and keep. And if maybe we can do it in populism, and a kind of left populism. With, you know, if you look at the true and only heaven, his figures are like the Populist Party, but also like Martin Luther King and interestingly, I mean, as another interesting thing about a difference between Lasch and Genovese, Lasch does not talk about the Civil War hardly at all. Like Lasch talks about the periods right before it and right after it a ton. But the Civil War is like really not something Lasch touches. And
that's a great point. I never thought about that. That's actually a very good point.
Yeah, it's something that you actually kind of just like a big gaping hole in the literature. You're like, even when he writes his critique of progressivism, as a defense of like left populism, he just skips the Civil War. Like, it's like we have the kind of populists in the early republic, and then we have like post Civil War, like 19th century stuff, which he focused on before in his kind of like more properly Marxist period in the late 60s. But you don't have a lot of discussion of the Civil War. You do have a lot more discussion in Lasch of the peace movement around World War I and World War II, right, particularly World War I. And then the failure for, you know, Lasch is particularly concerned his entire life with like the Cold War was unnecessary, which also means he can never even be a paleo conservative because they're not willing to grant that. But he's, you know, he thinks that, you know, even that we should have had some kind of detente with the Soviet Union from moment one. That's also something that's completely missing from Genovese. So those are some key differences. Whereas Genovese is not as concerned about the populist tradition at all. Like, you know, he did because of his focus on the Civil War. It seems like that's also why he's focusing on these Southern conservative followers and Confederates. And that does seem to cast kind of a pale over him, particularly once we see his disillusionment with Italian Eurocommunism.
I think it's made me think a lot, because one thing to think about is I think Genovese might be more critical of the working class, but he doesn't write a ton about them in general. I mean, he has Roll, Children, Roll and the one from 1979, Revolution, is in the title. Derick, you mentioned it earlier. Those are kind of a detour in the larger Genovese project, which is a lifelong study of the Southern ruling class, right? The slave owners. And so even in these pieces where he's talking about, the students aren't the working class, their values are different to them, we don't really get a detailed picture of like what he sees the working class at any historical moment in the United States, let alone in the 60s, as being, except for a community that is opposed to middle-class students at private universities, basically.
Yeah. So let me take us now to the moment of, I guess, the mid 1970s and the formation of this idea, how the idea formed to create a journal dedicated to serious, world-renowned scholarship on Marxist studies in the United States, called Marxist Perspectives, founded by Genovese. Lasch is not a founder, or is he a founder?
He's an editor, yeah. But he's on the editorial board.
So one thing I can say briefly is that, they did their networking very well. They got, E.P. Thompson was still alive. He agreed to write a piece. Edward Said agreed to come on to write something. Noam Chomsky, I think, agreed to be an advisor. So they got like the who's who of the global left to support this project. And you make a point, Gabriel, that I really felt was tragic. And this is kind of a tragic story we're going to talk about here, which is that, the kind of McCarthyite intensity within American intellectual life had dissipated.
Yes.
And in reality, there was a sort of opening for, and maybe even you could say a general acceptance at a broad institutional level for a project like this, right? And so the question we have is sort of where it came from and sort of why it went sour.
Yeah.
That's the trajectory, but start us from its formation, if you would.
So in the late 1960s, there's a series, or mid-1960s, late 1960s, there's these things called socialist scholar conferences, which are these kind of bringings together of different socialist thinkers. And within that, there starts to be a conversation. There's actually do we need a third political party? The standard conversations that happen kind of every 30 years within the left, like what should we do? But one of them is we need a rigorous academic journal that can kind of border the conversation between the academy and the public. This, starts in the 1960s. Lasch and Genovese start working together at the University of Rochester. I think Genovese is hired in 1969. He brings Lasch in. Genovese tries to hire Paul Gottfried. Fun fact, Lasch votes against him. Gottfried doesn't get the job, just that's a fun aside. But they are working together. There's also someone called Herbert Gutman. If we had more time, we could talk about a lot. Who's a really other important socialist historian of this era. They have a huge falling out at Rochester, which kind of postpones the chance of this journal taking off in the early 1970s. But actually, the late 1970s at the time seems more ripe. In retrospect, maybe we realize that the ground was changing. But actually, by the late 1970s, it seems like a really vibrant time for Marxist scholarship. We go back to the point that Genovese's book had been accepted and won the biggest prize. He's head of a huge, important historical organization, or not necessarily huge, but an important organization within the academy. And then you have, obviously, the influence of British Marxism, E.P. Thompson, but also Eric Hobsbawm. And so they really start to think seriously about this, about starting a journal. And they do. It's called Marxist Perspectives. It's meant to be an alternative, say, to what the New York Review of Books is for liberals, or commentary was and is for conservatives. So something that has kind of long, rigorous scholarship, but not necessarily in your standard academic journal style. Something that could be read inside and outside the academy. And this really should have been the vehicle for kind of starting a new generation of Marxist scholarship, at least within the historical profession. But it brings in, Frederic Jameson from kind of, a literary department is like also someone who's involved. But it brings in all these prominent left-wing historians, so people like Erich Foner. If you look at kind of all the people below, they're all people who went on to have really established careers. And it lasts 10 issues and collapses after 2 years. And really, you can see after that Genovese's politics. If they don't immediately shift to the right, he really starts to distance himself from figures on the left, at least. The magazine had strong financial footing. So the question is, why does it collapse? And I mean, it had some really important articles within there. I mean, I was just looking at the first one. I mean, in the first issue alone, you have an article by Hobsbawm, an article by Lise Vogel, an article by Lasch, Mark Tushnet, Umberto Cerrone, the Italian historian, Gore Vidal, and David Montgomery. David Montgomery is an important kind of left-wing labor historian. So you have all these figures writing within it, and that's just the first issue. And so the question is, why does it fall apart? And the main reason is that Genovese has a kind of dictatorial control over the magazine, over the journal, sorry, and starts to use the journal, particularly the editorial page, for kind of having political fights with people he dislikes in the academy. And when he starts to lose control of it, when there's more asks for kind of democratic accountability, he eventually resigns. But there is a really important flashpoint in the months leading up, which I think is one of the reasons that we wanted to have this conversation, which is Christopher Lasch pens an article in the first edition. And Derick and Daniel, I'd really encourage you both to kind of jump in on this, but it's probably worth we flesh out a little bit of kind of the context of the academy at this time, because, you know, second wave feminism has occurred by this point, and it's had a tremendous impact on the historical profession. And I mean that both in the sense of, you know, compared to the 1950s, the academy is no longer just white men. It's more racially diverse than it was, and there's a lot more women in the historical profession. And the impact of second wave feminism has a real impact on the historical profession. So, for example, there was one women's studies program in the entire country in 1969. There's over 200 by about 1976. So there's a kind of new generation of scholarship in what is called then women's history coming through. A lot of it written by socialist feminists, and some Marxist feminists. And so the journal really emerges in this important moment of scholarship. And Lasch is asked to pen an article for the first edition, and he pens an article effectively, and we can talk a little bit more about the content in a moment, on basically the relationship between the sexes under second wave feminism. And this is deeply problematic to several of the people who are involved in the Marxist Perspectives project, because particularly for socialist feminists involved in Marxist Perspectives, Lasch is not someone who they see as actively who identifies with the women's movement in the United States. In fact, they see him as someone who is actively hostile. And they are really concerned that the journal's kind of first major statement on gender, on the family, on women's history would come from someone who is not identified with the women's movement. They say very clearly to Genovese, this will create a lot of hostility and suspicion about the journal if we have Lasch kind of standing alone making the first major statement on this. And just before we get to the content of the article, they had set up an organizational structure where there was an informal women's group within the journal who would review anything on women's history, articles that looked at gender analysis. And when they see Lasch's article, which we'll talk about in a second, the women's group votes unanimously that it shouldn't be included in the first edition. And Genovese and the rest of the editorial will go over their heads and include it after revision. So this already creates a level of tension, I think, within the journal on a major issue at the time, which is unrepairable. Someone resigns from the journal because of what they see as the kind of dictatorial non-engagement with the views of the women's working group within it. And just another very brief point of context before I'll let you both of you talk about the article, because I'm sure you have a lot more insightful things than I have to say about it. But one thing that I think is important is that there was meant to be another article in that first edition. I think by Amy Bridges and Heidi Hartman, it's something like called The Unhappy Marriage of Feminism and Marxism, or Feminism and Socialism. It eventually actually gets published in a later journal by Heidi Hartman alone, I think. But this was seen as kind of a, if not a direct criticism of Lasch, at least a conversation that would be in there. Genovese effectively writes to the two scholars and says, you need to completely rewrite this. And it's not published in there. So there's also this issue of Genovese just telling other scholars, yeah, you're not going to be, your article isn't going to be included in this, while not accepting the criticisms of the Women's Working Group within it. And so I think even before we talk about the content of the article, this broader context really puts the journal on uneven footing in its early months.
Yeah, that's great. That's very interesting. I mean, I think I'd say a couple of things, right? Which is obviously Fox Genovese is in the background here as also as somebody like Lasch who has some bona fides in psychoanalysis and who is a kind of ambiguously conservative feminist, you know, kind of like an internal critic from a Marxist point of view. So you already get the sense that this milieu, right, is something close to something that is kind of more familiar to us now in the age of like the compact magazine, you know, that whole milieu, which, I mean, Derick Varn and I have talked about this at length. And there's a lot of ethical issues that it raises for anyone that considers themselves to be a socialist, and especially for anyone that considers themselves to be a feminist. I've read the article a couple times. It's called The Flight from Feelings. Lasch in the article will say that modern feminism is partially to blame for fomenting a sense of rivalry amongst the sexes. And he tries to make an argument largely based on criticism that he received from feminists that we should replace what he argues is that contemporary feminism is intensifying a resentment at the home between men and women, and we should replace that's leading to a sense of personal blame when it should be actually framed as class blame. And if it is framed as class blame, that's a different modality of power that depersonalizes it. Right. And his whole argument is that the forces of, which is an argument if you've read Culture of Narcissism, you'd be familiar with, which is that the proliferation of the marketization of the contemporary family and its forcing men and women alike into labor routines that are quite punitive and towards a kind of empty and shallow careerism is hollowing out. This is the notion of flight from feelings, is hollowing out the possibility of people actually getting back in touch with the complexity of love emotions, right? So he makes kind of distinction between emotions and feelings, and that there's really a kind of absence of authentic feeling. And he says feminism is partially to blame in like 6 or 7 points, and at some points he takes it, in my opinion, too far. I could quote some things that I found. He says the recent revival of feminism stirs up primitive emotions inside men such that they possess a fear of women. And then he even says this is why some sociological analysis that men now, whatever, in the early 80s, late 70s, prefer breasts to the vagina, because the vagina now is becoming an image of a kind of castration, of something that's going to eat you whole. So it's a desexualizing forces, and feminism is partially to blame for this, right? So it's no shock that these feminist scholars would be so not only personally offended, but also see this as an affront to Marxism.
Yeah.
So I think the question, Derick, I want your thoughts on this, is sort of, you know, what are the limits, right, of these kinds of views within Marxist scholarship?
Well, I mean, this gets us into the long array of like Christopher Lasch's debates with feminists, because he starts off in his trilogy in his mid-career in the late 60s really kind of early mid-career, talking about the feminism that won versus the feminism that didn't win in going through Agony of the American Left, The World of Nations. He writes a letter to a group of New Left Marxist scholars in 68 that actually expresses some of the things that's expressed in the 78 article, which gets him more or less booted from a discussion group in 68, 69. That leads him to writing Haven in the Heartless World. Almost like that book is almost literally a response to that. It also is what prompts him to really study psychoanalysis. If you read his some of his comments in about psychoanalysis in like Agony of the American Left are kind of funny because he talks about like, well, we can learn a lot from psychoanalysis, but they're always trying to like merge Marxism and psychoanalysis into a unified theory of everything. He kind of mocks that in 1968. Arguably, he's doing that in the late 1970s. But so this is like his main concern. He does not see himself initially as specifically hostile to feminism. He sees himself initially hostile to one form of it, which he sees as also being used as a way to hide the decline of wages too. So this is another part of his initial argument in the 70s, and it starts in actually as early as 71 in World of Nations, where he's like, well, it seems suspicious to me that in this time of high inflation that, we are valorizing people like Betty Friedan and pushing people into the market. What is fascinating to me is you want to get the most vociferous, angry letters for Lasch, where in almost every one of them, I think he goes too far. The Tikkun article that I mentioned, where he critiques the left, and then he actually critiques the right. Then he gets two responses, one from a Trotskyist whose name I've forgotten me, and the other from Lillian Rubin, who initially thought she was sympathetic to Lasch. Actually, she liked Haven in a Heartless World. And Lasch doubles down even more on this family tradition stuff. Now, there's an interesting conflict in Lasch, and I've had, when I recently presented a paper actually on this topic, on why he got so interested in Freudianism and his debates with feminism at a Society of Intellectual History conference. And I was told by one of his colleagues that I need to look into his personal life more to explain why this was such a big deal. But that he really did not like the way family research was going. And I will admit, for example, he makes claims about anthropology and family in 1987. This is like, kind of like, no, like, the only definition any anthropologist would accept of kinship as a man and woman for the purposes of procreation, which is something he says in 87. And I'm just like, actually, no anthropologist by 1987 would have said that. Symbolic kinship is like the major field of study at that point. But you see this doubling down. One thing that's interesting, though, is with Lasch, and I'm bracketing out the psychoanalytic parts of his argument. I would leave that to Daniel. But he actually does have some fairly good points about misrepresenting what is class conflict, or damage being done to a class as a kind of intra-class sex war. Like, I actually don't think that's totally wrong. But it does seem interesting that Genovese has to pull so many stunts to get that, to get that in the journal, and the kind of fracturing that it's going to do, because what you basically have is what we would now call today canceling, but it's an attempt to censor or deplatform someone who is generally seen as a leftist, but on this issue in particular has been the issue that puts him at odds with most of the rest of the left. I mean, the other issue that he kind of gets in trouble for is being skeptical of students, but by the 1970s, that period has faded anyway, so no one's picking up on that part of it.
There is a couple points in here I just want to point out that you can kind of, and Derick, you might be upset with me for saying this, but you can kind of see why some of the Red Scare girls like Lasch. I'll give you one example.
No, I'm not upset with you for saying that. I think
I'll give you one example. Listen to this. Feminist consciousness raising has had irreversibly negative effects in some regards because it has led women and men to question the inevitability of women's subordination. And this has meant that women can no longer retreat to the safety of discredited conventions. It's a really interesting argument. I mean, very strange argument in a certain way. What he's kind of saying is that traditionally, men and women had a primal sense of a kind of inbuilt organic or natural rivalry with each other. Like women are inferior, and we've inherited this mythologically from the past, and that shapes sexuality, right? That shapes the unconscious sexual relation itself. Well, feminist consciousness raising is foisting on, according to Lasch, some kind of false equality where you're no longer allowed to tap into that primal consciousness, right, in the bedroom, so to speak. And that's leading to desexualization, right? That's leading to a certain impotency, etc., right? So that's a very bombastic thing to say in a certain way. And it does become a question of, okay, well, who's saying that? I'm sorry to say, and I don't mean to sound like identity standpoint person here, but it does matter, I think. I don't know, Gabriel, how you see that, but I mean, I feel like perhaps it's a way of subtlety that is not missing here. I don't see too much subtlety here, you know? Lasch was also writing an aborted book on women, by the way, that never was published, right, Gabriel?
I actually didn't know that. I mean, it may well be.
I saw it in the interview. Remember the interview that you shared?
Yes, you're right.
And I think parts of that book actually end up in the Elizabeth Lasch Quinn edited book on women and feminism that is released like a decade after his death. So,
and one of the interesting things, I mean, one thing that I found really useful going through the correspondence with this is two things. One is that this question of class enemy versus opponent is something that comes out in the peer review process. So this question that I think, Derick, you're pointing towards is actually something that was being heavily debated between the different kind of members of the editorial committee of like whether Lasch had got that right or wrong. One thing that I think is also just important in terms of, Daniel, you were pointing toward, I think, towards the kind of Genovese himself sees this only through the prism of identity politics, right? He thinks this article is superb,
right?
And the only
he loves
reason
it
it's being criticized is because Lasch is a man, right?
Well, I wonder what,
as well as thinking about his longer trajectory,
right,
is where he sees the academy going, right? He becomes very much an embracer of kind of cancel, all the academy is cancel culture by the 90s. And so I think you can even see that argument. He's starting to formulate that here. I mean, one of the interesting things is in all his correspondence over this article, he doesn't engage with actually any of the critical arguments about whether or not there's a materialist analysis in this argument.
Right.
Because one of the big criticisms that comes out of this article is Lasch actually talking about the relationship between the sexes in the different kind of like what is the historical conditions and the material conditions in the moments he's speaking about. That's one of the earliest criticisms of this article, is that he doesn't address that. I mean, we can debate whether that's true, but Genovese never actually engages with any of these elements of that. He just says, you don't want this included because he's a man, right? And I think
Yeah, well,
that's a clear lie to his later thing.
I mean, you cannot you cannot accuse Lasch of a kind of idealist. You could, but you can't. Of an idealist claim, such that he's saying, oh well, feminism as a discourse, or like intellectual feminists are responsible for this schism that is emerging. No. He's saying that there is a materialist account for the emergence of this schism, but that intellectuals have failed on their duty, right, to adequately point it out, and unbeknownst to themselves, in some cases, they have been fanning the flames of it. And that the what does he call it? The sisterhood form of solidarity is opposed to, well, socialist forms of solidarity. I mean, it literally says that. Or it's hostile to that, right? It sees itself as in opposition to that, right? So he's saying some things that are extremely bold and not that tactful, unfortunately. I don't know. I mean, you almost wonder, you know, there's nuggets, there's as everything with Lasch, there's these nuggets of insights. When he wrote the introduction to Schmergel, a French psychoanalyst, her very important book on the ego ideal, he wrote 2 paragraphs about how the New Left's celebration of gender non-normative sexual expression, like basically what we would today call LGBTQ. I think I've mentioned this to you, Varn, in previous interviews, is itself regressive and is reflective of a pre-Oedipal perversion on the left. And it should be rejected, should be absolutely rejected. And so, you know, I think that the challenge here is one of, a lot of people would say, yes, he's like Genovese, he's right, and he's courageous, and therefore he's bold, like, you know, there's, whereas I think in reality what it is, it's not that, it's you're not tempering an otherwise perhaps sound insight with a proper, I don't know, like, that's my question to you guys. Like, how might you deal with something? This is the sort of enigma of Lasch for me, is how you temper, maybe, is the question, or how you sort of, because I think some people on the left would say, well, there's nothing of insight here because he's overshadowed all possible insight. Whereas I think for us, we're saying, well, no, actually there is, but I don't know how you guys see it.
I find that Lasch's writings on feminism and women are the most provocative and also the most problematic. And I don't just mean that in the like kind of, oh well, he's spiting liberal identity politics, but like, no, there's occasionally stuff that I hit in Minimal Self, or in some of these articles that he wrote in the late 70s, or in his debates with Lillian Rubin. I mean, the Lillian Rubin debate is particularly frustrating. I mean, that's from 10 years after this article, but like, he's agreeing with Lillian Rubin and still basically yelling at her. Like, it's a very weird debate. And so clearly this hits a deep note for Lasch. It also seems to be the basis in some ways of his continued relationship to Phil Reef, which
another person Genovese tries to hire.
Yeah. And I find, I suspect, and I don't know, that there might be biographical reasons for some of this. But it often feels like, particularly some stuff he said, like there's some stuff he says in minimum, in the minimal self about homosexuality that is not foreign to leftist thought in the 1960s. I mean, we have to like even remember that Fromm, for example, was pretty, has some pretty, and Adorno has some things that we would definitely consider homophobic today. But he makes some conclusions about like sex for pleasure and homosexuality as a manifestation of sex for pleasure that would strike almost anybody on the left today as profoundly conservative and hard to justify in a materialist analysis. I mean, even from the standpoint of like Engels's writings on the family, for for good and ill, and based off of 19th century anthropology as they were, Engels would have never gone to some of the places Lasch goes. However, I do think there's some real insights about the way the intellectual apparatus of feminism ends up being used in contemporary society, that if we ignore we're throwing a baby out with the bathwater. I don't think we have to go full Red Scare Angela Nagel to like see some of what he's talking about like what would today might be, and identitarian circles might be called white feminism, but in general, it's just like, well, liberal feminism tends to be copacetic with women entering the market and with market mechanisms in general. And Lasch is like, well, it just seems suspicious to me that you guys find all this really super liberating at the exact moment we need a lot of people to enter the workforce to hide the fact that wages have dropped so precipitously. Like this is a statement Lasch is making as early as 1972. So I don't think we can, like, when he's talking about misrecognition of like a class enemy and stuff, I think that part of that essay is fascinating, but I think he also takes it way too far in a way that also undermines any materiality to his analysis. And I actually find this is often a problem with Lasch. Like you start off with the material insight and then you end up with like some very bold statements being made that I can't materially support. And what I also find interesting, though, is these arguments seem much more important in some ways for Lasch's opponents than they do necessarily for what Lasch sees his political vision as. Like, and that's not true for Genovese. Genovese like doubles down on all this stuff.
Well, and I wonder as well if some of these arguments become more prominent for conservative anti-feminists who are much more to the right of Lasch at this time. I mean, I'm particularly thinking some of the early passages on kind of the collapse of chivalry, which I think is kind of way overplayed as this kind of thing that has been lost, even though kind of Lasch says, yeah, it's kind of good that we've lost chivalry, but we have lost all these kind of, things because of it. I think that, and then particularly some of the stuff focused on the divorce rate, right? Which seems to align much more with kind of conservative critiques today, particularly because there isn't, I mean, and maybe I would need to reread it. There isn't a kind of, well, what is a left solution to the divorce rate? Meaning, like, divorce should be allowed to happen, but like, how can we support people, when after divorces has happened, or like to be single parents, those kind of things. It's much more of a kind of conservative argument of divorce seems to be bad. I mean, I think I may be misreading this, but
yeah, no, that's a good point, because I think on the one hand, he is pushing back against a latent utopianism that it seems to permeate left thinking on the family, which puts that question aside because all that it cares about is this futural focus on the liberated society, right? So Lasch is inviting us to think about the conditions for the flourishing in the present in a certain way without these utopian distractions, And that's very hard to do, because usually when you do that, you fall victim to an intense traditionalism. So Lasch wants to avoid that while also paying attention to it, to the realities of these how they're affecting us psychically, sexually, and so on. But I mean, look, I think, one of the things that happens here is that, these two intellectual figures, Lasch and Genovese, both abandon Marxism as public intellectuals. As many people say, Lasch in the post-war period is the example of an American public intellectual. So therefore, it matters, right? It matters how you define your politics as a public intellectual. And one of the things that happens today with a lot of folks on, say, family abolition left that I engage with, as somebody who dialogues with them and who's not hostile to them, I'm not a post-leftist. I don't even consider myself anti-woke, although I'm critical of it, is that they say, well, Lasch abandoned Marxism because that's what he said. And I was wondering if I could ask you guys your thoughts on that, because it feels to me that the stakes of this project of creating a Marxist journal in America that would be distinctly American also has a bearing on the meaning of what it is to be a Marxist, right? And therefore, then who defines the parameters, right, of who is and who isn't a Marxist? And I always found that interesting, right, as a kind of as a speech act, or as kind of like an identification that you make for yourself, and sort of what you guys think about that, right? Which is sort of, you could envision an alternate history in which this project is successful. What would that look like?
Well,
How could you balance, right, the cultural conservatism of the Genoveses, keeping them within the fold of Marxism, while also incorporating these new left orientations, these second wave, these militant feminist orientations? That's the question for me, is the question of, why can't Marxism be large enough to offer a home to those expressions?
We have to be fair, though, about the radical feminists by the time you get to the 1980s, because they are also distancing themselves from Marxism, like Sandra Brown and the standpoint epistemology people, who get their argument initially by reapplying Lukács's class consciousness argument from his early books to gender specifically, and using that to come up with an epistemological framework, right? None of them by the 1990s are still Marxist. Not a one of them. And so that trajectory cannot, we can't just read that as like, oh, it's an inner Marxist fight and Lasch and Genovese leave. Lasch says in 1987, and he starts hinting at it as early as Minimal Self, that he sees Marxism as a failed project. Unlike Genovese, though, you never get a full-throated denouncement. You just don't. And you get returns to Marxism as late as 1991, when he's like dying, basically when he's dying of cancer. So with Lasch, you have someone who's wrestling with this his entire life. And the other thing Lasch would say, and I know he would say it because he says it in The True and Only Heaven, is that he never really completely thought of himself as an Orthodox Marxist in the first place. He thought himself as coming out of the Marxist tradition, but that, like Foucault, he's one of the first people to use Foucault in America. Lasch does that as early as 1969. That a lot of the Frankfurt School, that he views Marxism as actually abandoning Marxism's focus on the working class. And so that's why he's leaving it. He doesn't see himself as leaving the Marxist project a la the original focus of class politics. He sees that he feels that they've left their goal. That's a completely different thing than Genovese, who's like, no, the whole project was wrong.
So I think yes and no. So I think Genovese, like in his The Dissent article, so that we touched on this at the beginning, but in 94, he writes this question called The Question in Dissent, which is kind of, when did you know about the horrors of communism? Kind of, and his idea is like, we knew all along, but we thought we were creating a more important world. And a load of people respond to him in this argument. So he basically says, look, the argument for Marxism was that it could create a better economic system than capitalism, and that has failed. And it's created all these atrocities along the way, and that's therefore why I'm no longer a Marxist. But at the same time, I think there is an element of this, and not to put words in your mouth, Derick, but this kind of Laschian thing of like, I didn't leave the left left me, when it comes to kind of, he sees the left becoming the new left, by which he understands the new left to be kind of individualism, cultural radicalism, a culture of do what you want, you know. I mean, Lasch has that argument in, maybe it's the late interview, it might even be a Revolt of the Elites, where he says the new left basically has the same governing philosophy as Thatcherism, right? It's like there is no such thing as society. And I think, you know, that's what Lasch says, that unites them both. And I think there's a bit of that in Genovese, is this kind of, there isn't a left that I can identify with even beyond the collapse of it. It's a kind of, because all of his articles in the 90s, if you look at Genovese, he publishes a couple of books, mainly essay collections, but mainly he's writing in the New Republic when it's kind of still kind of centrist, center-right, and he's writing in National Review. And mainly he is writing kind of screeds against what he perceives as political correctness on campuses, right? So there's these big defenses of Francis. He writes a book review of, which is very supportive. And the big one is he writes a big defense, although tempered, of Dinesh D'Souza. And within all of these, A Liberal Education, which is the book that makes D'Souza. And so it's within all of these, I think there is also this argument that Genovese is putting forward, which is the left I also used to embrace no longer exists, right? So I think there's that element alongside the economic project has collapsed.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a tragedy for me because I hold the view, and I don't know if you all see it as I do, but, let's say 21st century Marxism has to learn from the errors of this period. And one of them being the fact that, a project this is why I wanted to interview you, Gabriel, because this is sort of like exactly, the preconditions for any successful instantiation of Marxism. It may sound like a cliche, but the Bolsheviks did teach us that, you do have to start a rigorous journal that becomes, that plants certain seeds, right? I'm serious. I mean, it's not an adolescent fantasy, but so it's a serious project, which I still kind of feel that we have a void in that regard. We have a void in that regard of something like a left voice that could actually, now, I mean, that may be a cliche because then you can go back to me and say, yeah, well, everyone's tried a journal and they've sprouted and they've kind of failed. And that's a whole other thing that I'm talking about. But this does strike me. Marxist Perspectives does strike me as something which was very unique in the history of the American left. And it's very unfortunate that it never fully blossomed. I mean, that's something we could also talk about, is sort of the history of U.S. Marxist journals, how you guys see Marxist Perspectives. What was it trying to fulfill? Has its mission been fulfilled by other journals? Has it not? Was its aspirations bolder than other journals are? How do you guys see that, in relationship to other journals? Because obviously we could talk about the history of left-wing journals. How would you put it there, please?
I mean, I think even beyond, like, you don't even need to look to Bolsheviks. Like the New Left Review has been hugely important in terms of the British left. I think is like a useful kind of parallel in terms of trying to have conversations between the academy and the public, and having kind of this rigorous process, and has lasted a long time doing that. I mean, I certainly would say that I don't think the kind of mission that it aimed for has been fulfilled in a different way. I mean, I think,
I agree.
At least, we're all from different disciplines, so I think it'd be interesting. But I would say that I think there has been, in general, a distinct turn away from Marxism within the historical profession since that period.
Right.
And I mean, if we had longer, I think it would be interesting to think about some of how the cultural arguments that are brought in by people like Genovese might actually influence the cultural turn more broadly that happens. But I think the big change has been the cultural turn, which has been away from class as kind of the central category of analysis in a lot of historical departments. And I think there is a new generation, I would say, of American Marxist historians now emerging. But there are some, but I think at the same time, what I would say is more happening is that there are people who are interested in the question of inequality. And I think economics has come back as an area of study within history departments. But I wouldn't say that's always necessarily within a Marxist framework, if that makes sense. And I mean, Derick, I think your training is in English, right? So I mean, at least my impression is that there remains more of a vibrant Marxist tradition within English than I would say in history.
I would say yes, if you don't want your Marxism to be particularly Marxist. So there is, I know that sounds like a snarky sectarian thing to say. In some ways, it is, but like, I think Jameson is actually paradigmatic of what literary Marxism has kind of looked like, which is Frankfurt School, doing interesting readings of particular Marx texts, but actually in some ways actively removing any economic content or political content from the text, and treating them as what I would consider concept generators. So, which is, this is a whole other thing I could talk to Daniel about, but I more or less changed fields because not in training, but in what I actually publish in, because I don't love the idea that you read a text for conceptual apparatuses to build a paper, and then that's really where you stop with it. But I would say that Marxism never had the tarnished reputation in literary and critical studies that it seems to have in history. Although I would also say that Marxist historiography is still somewhat, it's a tarnished tradition, but it's not considered a joke. Whereas the critical studies, critical Marxism, literary Marxism paradigm, while not considered a joke at all, I mean, it doesn't have the same influence outside of our field. So like Marxist historiography actually touches on other things. Marxist literary criticism is very, I would say, niche. That said, one of the things I'll say about like the great tradition of Marxist scholars today is almost all of them are writing outside of their field of study. This is like the tradition that I see right now is like someone goes and does Marxism when it's like either A, have tenure, or B, give up on getting tenure. So it's like that seems to be a more serious thing. I would also say we don't have journals like that anymore. There's lots of Marx-esque publications, and there's lots of like, Jacobin, or as I sometimes like to call it, Gerongian, when I'm being a jerk, is kind of a Marx adjacent publication, but it's not the same thing as like a rigorous academic journal by any stretch of the imagination. Right. Catalyst magazine tries to be that for what we might say is social democratic adjacent analytic Marxism as a revival school around like Vivek Chebber and Ben Burgess and people like that. Right. Not sure that it really meets that. It's both too broad and too niche simultaneously. Yeah.
It's too exclusive. It's exclusive of a lot of other currents of Marxist orientation as well.
Right. And Monthly Review used to be that broad, but is no longer. So right. Interestingly, if you were to say like where do American Marxists publish, most of us publish, if we're publishing something specifically on Marxism in a Marxist journal, we're publishing in British journals. Like we're publishing in the New Left Review, Marxism and Philosophy, and almost all these are in the UK. So that or we're publishing academic quality work in and what is effectively non-academic journals. So people, so like journals where are publications where there's not really a sense of peer review. There is a, people will document stuff. Occasionally you see good stuff coming into that, but they're effectively not, they're not peer review edited. And so your claims and stuff don't really have to be rigorous. And that, I do think that's a problem. I mean, the one thing I will say about the academia part versus the rigorous part is, rigorous journals of debate and discussion are a long part of the Marxist tradition. I mean, even pre-Bolsheviks, really. That said, them being associated with like peer review and academic presses and not parties is kind of a middle 20th century phenomenon.
True.
And New Left Review is actually kind of interesting in that it kind of starts as a party organ and ends up as more of an academic organ, which is kind of which puts it on an interesting trajectory. And I think now I would almost say when we talk about New Left Review as like British, it feels like it's almost as American as it is British today.
Yeah.
Like it's somehow split between the two of us. But yeah, that's my commentary on it. We do have Marxist presses that, Haymarket, Verso kind of, Repeater,
Zero.
Well, yeah, I was about to say Zero and Repeater are almost the same thing now.
So the same thing, yeah.
Some degree sublation, but we don't have. I don't think we have a Marxist journal. Like,
I guess what interests me about Marxist Perspectives is this possible fusion of a distinctly American-centered, ambitious project, which had the wherewithal of the entirety of elite academia sort of behind it, right? But which was so ardently publicly forward, but its footing was public. It was almost as if the academic concerns were secondary to it, but it felt as if it was trying to invent and be a leg to a public discourse, to the vitalization of a public discourse. It's that mission that I see missing. You see my point? It was so knowledgeable about trying to break out of academic silos because it had already solved academic credentialism because of Genovese's position and Lasch's position. They were already very senior. And that was the beautiful thing about it. They could put all of the pettiness of academia to the side. It wasn't really about academia. For them, it was about this is an engine for the invention of a true socialist workers' party.
But then, ironically, it's these lingering academic fights that bring it down in many ways, even though it has built up the credibility to be able to do that. The other thing that I was wondering, Derick, because you also touched on kind of the British journals, is I think there is something interesting that we shouldn't take for granted, that it explicitly called itself Marxist Perspectives, right, in the United States. I think that speaks to something that, I mean, would have been more usual in Britain, but even New Left Review didn't call itself New Marxist Review or something. But if you look at Studies on the Left, which is kind of the big left-wing journal from 59 to 67, that journal completely splits between a kind of the New American Marxist tradition and the New Left tradition. But there is a huge fight within that over whether or not they should call themselves socialists. And people like Tom Hayden from the New Left saying, we cannot say this is a socialist journal because it will alienate too many people in the United States. And so I think it is interesting that only a decade or two later, a journal also felt confident enough that it could be successful, saying we are an explicitly Marxist project, not saying left perspectives, or so.
Right.
I think that speaks to an important change, at least within the American academy.
And they were, at least at first, smart enough, because the meaning of that is that it's an implicit homage of a critique, as I read it, to the New Left.
Yes.
Yeah, no, we are Marxists. We are. But then they had the feminists on board, and they had the various constituencies on board, as on the editorial board at first, to see if we could take this and get it off the ground. But that didn't work. That didn't happen.
Well, I mean, this is a question for me, Daniel and Gabriel, to some degree. If these things don't collapse, do they necessarily become sectarian? I was thinking about like Monthly Review, which did not start out as a sectarian, publication. It had its ties to like whatever Paul Sweezy and Baron were doing, but like there were Trotskyists, Maoists, there were Stalinists who worked for the Monthly Review in the 70s. Like they even published Hal Draper, for fuck's sake. But like, that's while that the Monthly Review now they'll publish non-Marxist stuff. They'll publish like heterodox economics. It's still they have a very particular line that they push on, like eco-socialism or imperialism. Do we just think that that's what happens over time? I mean, New Left Review is interesting because it doesn't go sectarian. In fact, it has sectarian origins and doesn't maintain them. But I also think it's also very important. There's a long period where I was reading New Left Review where there was nary a Marxist article in it. Like in the late 90s, like even up until like when TJ Clark was writing stuff, like they were still like writing about the death of Marxism as late as like 2012 when it's like coming back. So it's it just seems to me there's a tension there that is compounded by two things. One, sectarian fights, and the other is inter-academic fights. And those rhyme, but they're not exactly the same thing. I mean, and that's one of the interesting things about that we should like maybe mention about Genovese and Lasch, and they're heading a Marxist Perspectives, is they don't have any Marxist sectarian background. Like yeah, Genovese is like interested in Italian Eurocommunism. Yes, he was a member of the CPUSA, but he doesn't like in the 1970s join like a Maoist faction or
right.
No,
Marxists call him a Weberian, and he's like, I don't care.
Right? Yeah. Like he's not that concerned about that.
He's briefly the editor of a short-lived Marxist-Leninist journal, I think, in the early 1960s, but is still not actively identified with a kind of sectarian wing in the way that we would see other people, I would say, or figures within the British tradition, that is.
Yeah, that's a certain advantage, though. I mean, in a certain way, it's a kind of advantage, because I think what it means is that a project is colored by a highly singular, maybe too singularly focused American context. I mean, it really. It probably, if it would have been successful, you could see its trajectory as possibly possibly too parochialized into an American centric project. That's possible if the Socialist Party was not generated from it, and so on in a hypothetical scenario. But still, nonetheless, I want to be respectful of everyone's time. We have gone over 2 hours. It has flown by. I grant you that. And I hope that everyone listening has got a lot out of this conversation. I certainly have. Your essay has been incredible. I just learned so much reading it, and I literally found 6 or 7 books to read from reading it. So that's a testament of a great scholarship right there. So thank you for that very much.
Thank you so much. And I've loved this talk. Do you mind if I do a quick plug?
Please.
Which is, so I've been working, started to try and work on Genovese stuff again. For those of you who know, Genovese destroyed his own archive. He burnt all his personal papers before he died. So if you go through my article or other people, you'll see that I've gone to a load of archives of other historians that he has written to. And that's how I build a lot of my arguments. So if you ever come across this is to listeners out there already watching. If you ever come across, letters that Genovese has written to someone in an archive, please email me and let me know if you knew him and would be willing to, share reflections either by email or something. I would really appreciate that. And, if you're in Boston, I'll buy you a drink or a cup of coffee or whatever, because I know I shouldn't be the historian who's doing a 20th century project complaining about issues with an archive. I know it's a lot harder for people who work in different centuries. But the fact that he decided to destroy all his personal papers makes writing some of the elements of this project harder. So if you ever find any of those letters, please
thank you.
Me.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, please do that.
Awesome.
We'll link to your page. I mean, it's not surprising that he pulled a kind of Kafka-esque. I mean, he's a tragic figure, right? Yeah. I mean, what can you say? I mean, he's what a colorful personality. My God. My goodness. But any final remarks from either Derick? This has been a tour de force. Thank you both for being here.
Yeah, I guess I find Genovese fascinating because his political journey is like the opposite of mine. I was never a neo-Confederate, but I was paleo-conservative and paleo-conservative adjacent in my very early 20s. Sort of the anti-war movement of Georgia was a conservative anti-war movement. I think people don't tend to realize that. It's not so much true anymore, but and these figures are fascinating to me, and I find them really interesting. And I find it interesting who we cut slack for, like who we go back as like, oh well, they ended not a Marxist, we can't trust any of their work, and then who there's lots of people who defect to liberalism who we still consider their Marxist works valid that I find kind of a little sus. Like
that's a good point.
Like so
that's a very good point.
It's that would be my only like criticism is
there's a lot of texts that are written in an ambiguous position between Marxism and liberalism where we judge it as more Marxist than it should have been.
Right.
That's a whole other thing we could talk about at a later time.
Yeah,
I'm sure you could think of some examples of that.
The great debate around the Frankfurt School is how much is second gen Frankfurt School actually, and by second gen I mean Adorno, Horkheimer, because I don't start the first gen with them. How much are they still Marxist by 1965 is actually an open question to me that I don't feel comfortable answering. So yeah, there's lots of that.
Well, thank you all for listening. We must have you back on at some point, Gabriel, and Derick Varn. We will be seeing you in other programs very soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.